Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing Ghost in the Shell 2, Man-Machine Interface. Now, I've got to confess that I was quite looking forward to reading this manga. I'd heard from several sources some very positive things about it. As a fan of the Ghost in the Shell franchise, I was quite intrigued by the fact that, as far as I'm aware, this story has not been adapted into any other Ghost in the Shell media. And also I'd heard about the artwork. I'd heard that Shirow Masamune had chosen a kind of a very interesting, unique way to develop the artwork. And that's something I'll discuss more once we reach the actual artwork section of this review. Of course, the question is, as always, is the manga any good? And that's what we're going to be discussing today. So let's get started. So what is the story of Ghost in the Shell 2? Man-Machine Interface. Ghost in the Shell 2, Man-Machine Interface follows the Major several years after the end of the original Ghost in the Shell manga. Interestingly, she has chosen to change her name from Motoko Kusanagi to Motoko Aramaki, which I think is quite an interesting choice. And near the beginning of the manga, she's contacted to begin investigating a case. Basically, there has been some riots in a city called Hanawa. And these riots are down to both ethnic tensions as well as unpaid back wages. And to add fuel to the fire, there is this colonel from the National Army who's helping to stoke these ethnic tensions. And basically they want Motoko to help prevent any kind of intervention, whether from a neighboring country or from a UN force. And Motoko ends up accepting the case, and that's how the story begins. Now, the story in this manga is very much a mixed bag. On one hand, I find a lot of the concepts explored in this manga quite interesting, and clearly so does Shirow Masamune, who makes it an effort on his part to leave loads of footnotes explaining why he wanted to discuss this particular theme or technology, how he thinks it might impact human society, the future, etc, etc. And a lot of those footnotes are quite interesting, albeit a little long-winded. On the other hand, I'm not a particularly big fan of the execution of the story, nor the characters. So, starting off with the characters, besides Aramaki, who has a very brief appearance in this manga, Motoko is the only returning character from the original Ghost in the Shell manga. And even then, she is quite changed, particularly because of the events that happened at the end of that manga. She is cold and detached. And while that makes sense from a story perspective, particularly given what ended up happening at the end of the first Ghost in the Shell manga, it doesn't mean that I find her particularly enjoyable to read. In many ways, she's a much more unappealing character in this manga compared to the prior volumes. Besides that, she does have some assistance in the form of these little robots. Now, I tried researching to see if they have any names, and as far as I can tell, they are simply referred to as Motoko's assistants. But they are clearly the comic relief of the manga, in many ways similar to the Tachikoma of the Ghost in the Shell TV series. And to be fair, they can be quite appealing to look at. However, from a character perspective, they don't have any particular substance, simply assisting Motoko as she investigates these cases. The rest of the characters in this series I felt quite unattached to. Either they were introduced with seemingly little fanfare, to the point where I wasn't even sure who they were, or they had such an unappealing personality that I just didn't care what happened to them. And moving on to the actual execution of the story itself is very messy, and personally I found it quite difficult to actually follow. It just kind of feels like the Major is moving from case to case with very little kind of causality, and without any kind of human investment in the actual story, such as the stories from Ghost in the Shell 1.5, where I actually did feel quite attached to many of the characters involved. I just kind of ended up losing interest after a while. So to quickly summarize, while I did find many of the ideas and themes explored in this manga quite fascinating or interesting, I did end up being put off by the unlikable characters, as well as the kind of messy presentation of the story itself. Now, moving on to the artwork itself. Now, the artwork here is very interesting. Shirow Masamune decided that he was going to do this manga digitally, and not only do hand-drawn artwork for the manga, but also include a lot of CGI. Now, I confess that this is the only manga that I'm aware of that actually has CG in it. If anyone is aware of any other manga series that incorporates CGI, I'd be very interested to hear that in the comments below. But back to the artwork itself. A lot of the artwork here is presented in color, which is quite interesting. I would even go so far as to say that about half of the manga is in color, which is quite pleasant. However, I do have some criticisms of the actual color itself. To me, it has a bit of a smudgy look to it. In contrast, the kind of sharp, sleek look in the previous Ghost in the Shell manga. And I do think that is quite interesting that after this manga, Shirow Masamune would go on to create Gal Grease, where all the girls look like they're all greased up. Because to me, that is kind of how the manga looks. It looks smudgy, it looks greasy. While there are certain scenes that look pleasant, I'm just not the biggest fan of the way that this manga was colored. And speaking of the CGI, now the CGI is a very mixed bag. On one hand, I do actually like the way the CG is done for Motoko's assistants. I think they have a very appealing design. The fact that their CG doesn't really bother me that much. There's a pleasant amount of detail with them. I think as CG creations, they work quite well. Where it doesn't work quite well is in many of the backgrounds. Things like submarines, things like the environments, to me, have this kind of low detail, polygonal look to them, which I find kind of unappealing to look at. Now, at a certain point in the manga, it does actually revert back to black and white. And the black and white artwork here, for the most part, I actually do like quite a bit. There's a nice amount of detail. It seems that there's no CGI used in any of the black and white artwork, which I think allows a lot of the backgrounds to kind of really stand out more. Another thing to say about the artwork here, which is very much a step back from the previous Ghost in the Shell manga, is the amount of fan service in this manga. For whatever reason, there is an unbelievable number of crotch shots in this manga. And to be honest, I'm not a big fan of this. I just found them very distracting. And there's a scene near the end of the manga to do with the Major's crotch, which I found so weird and repulsive that it genuinely made me feel quite angry at this manga. So ultimately, while this manga was a very interesting experiment when it came to using CGI in manga, I ultimately think that it was a bit of a failure. It created a manga that, in my personal opinion, is actually less appealing to look at than the previous Ghost in the Shell manga, which I think is quite a shame. And the point where it switches to black and white artwork really helps to emphasize that. I do think that there's a lot of potential to the idea of using CGI in manga. And I would love, again, if any of you guys are aware of any other manga series that incorporate CGI, I'd love for you to inform me. But going off this, the artwork itself is definitely a mixed bag. Now, with regards to the way that this was presented, now this was released by Kodansha USA, just like the previous Ghost in the Shell manga. And if we compare it to my trusty Yotsuba, you will see that again it is quite big. It is the same trim size as the previous manga, which is very nice. It allows the artwork to breathe more. I'm a fan of that. The paper quality is as good as previous releases, which is great. But beyond that, there are actually very few extras in this manga, which I found quite surprising. There is a little bit of a foreword from Shirow Masamune, titled Apologies and Corrections, interestingly. And while some of the information there is quite interesting, I found it particularly surprising when I reached the end of this book and found absolutely no extras besides the special effects index pages. The previous manga, Ghost in the Shell 1.5, had a very interesting story commentary section, as well as an afterword from Shirow Masamune. So considering the unique way that Shirow Masamune produced this manga, how different it is compared to many other manga series, I would have loved to have had some kind of behind the scenes of it. You know, what kind of choices did he make? What kind of technology did he do? Some of the challenges that he faced. It would have been interesting to have Shirow Masamune's own personal thoughts on the struggles of making this manga. So I was quite disappointed at that. Now, I can't necessarily blame Kodansha USA for it. It might be entirely possible that there are no extras in the original Japanese version, and in that case, Kodansha USA can only do what they have been given. So I'm not entirely sure who to blame for those lack of extras. Overall, it's an okay release. It's a nice hardcover, it's got good paper quality, it's nice and big, but I do confess to being quite disappointed by the lack of extras, particularly given how unique this manga is. So in conclusion, what are my thoughts on Ghost in the Shell 2 Man-Machine Interface? As you've probably surmised, I'm not a particularly big fan of this manga. I was quite disappointed in it. And in my personal opinion, out of Ghost in the Shell 1, Ghost in the Shell 1.5, Ghost in the Shell 2, I personally believe that Ghost in the Shell 2 is the weakest. Now, Ghost in the Shell fans, particularly diehard ones, are probably still going to be quite interested in checking this manga out. After all, there are a lot of very interesting ideas. The story has not been adapted into other media, so in order to be able to experience the story, you will have to read the manga yourself. But beyond that, I honestly can't recommend this manga to anyone else. Not to sci-fi fans, not to regular manga fans, or even in general. So those were my thoughts on Ghost in the Shell 2 Man-Machine Interface. Let me know your own thoughts on this manga in the comments below. Did you actually enjoy it? If you did enjoy it, could you explain why you enjoyed it? Are you like me? Were you disappointed by this manga? And if you were disappointed, why were you disappointed? Was it the story? Was it the characters? Was it the artwork? What are your thoughts on the use of CGI in manga? Can you think of any other manga series that use CGI? And of course, if you have any other additional information on this, on Shiro Masamune, on Ghost in the Shell, on this manga, please leave that in the comments below. And of course, if you want to support the channel, I would encourage you to use my Amazon affiliate links as well as my Right Stuf affiliate link in the description below. When you purchase an anime or manga through those affiliate links, not only are you supporting me, not only are you supporting the channel, but you're also supporting the anime and manga industry. So I would highly encourage you to use those affiliate links to purchase your anime and manga. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.